Hey guys, Miss Shankle's back here, and we are going to start this week in our study of the Phantom Tollbooth on chapter 10. Okay, so if we just kind of recap a little bit of what happened in the last chapter that we read, Milo, Talk, and Humbug have met this young boy called Alec Bing. And Alec Bing and his kind all start, remember, they start growing when they're born. They are born exactly the height as they will always be, and then they grow down. Okay, so, and then there was this whole idea in chapter 9 about the idea of perspective and point of view and how you look at things. Okay, well, obviously in this book, that is very true, right? The way Milo looks at things matters. And he's constantly being challenged in that area all throughout the book. Well, this next chapter, Alec Bing is going to be taking the crew, the three guys here, Humbug, Talk, and Milo, to a new place to visit someone. And we're going to see this idea again about point of view. And it's going to be confusing a little bit. So let's see if we can talk through it, okay? So we'll be on chapter 10, A Colorful Symphony. As they ran, tall trees closed in around them and arched gracefully toward the sky. The late afternoon sunlight leaped lightly from leaf to leaf, slid along the branches and down trunks, and dropped finally to the ground in warm, luminous patches. A soft glow filled the air with the kind of light that made everything look sharp and clear and close enough to reach out and touch. Alec raced ahead, laughing and shouting, but soon encountered serious difficulties. Because remember, Alex said that he could see through things. Okay, he had perspective, but he couldn't see what was right in front of his nose, right? So look what happens. Here's an example of that. For while he could always see the tree behind the next one, he never could see the next one itself and was continually crashing into it. After several minutes of wildly dashing about, they all stopped for a breath of air. I think we're lost, panted the Humbug, collapsing into a large berry bush. Nonsense, shouted Alec from the high branch on which he sat. Do you know where we are? Asked Milo. Certainly, he replied. We're right here, on this very spot. Besides, being lost is never a matter of not knowing where you are. It's a matter of not knowing where you aren't. That doesn't make sense, does it? And I don't care at all about where I'm not. This was much too complicated for the bug to figure out, and Milo had just begun repeating it to himself when Alex said, If you don't believe me, ask the giant. And he pointed to a small house tucked neatly between two of the largest trees. Milo and Talk walked up to the door, whose brass nameplate simply read, The Giant, and knocked. Good afternoon, said the perfectly ordinary-sized man who answered the door. And see the picture there? It's a perfectly ordinary-sized boy. He doesn't look like a giant, does he? Are you the giant? Asked Talk doubtfully. To be sure, he replied proudly. I'm the smallest giant in the world. What can I do for you? Are we lost? Asked Milo. That's a difficult question, said the giant. Why don't you go around back and ask the midget? And he closed the door. They walked to the rear of the house, which looked exactly like the front, and knocked at the door, whose nameplate read, The Midget. How are you? Inquired the man, who looked exactly like the giant. Are you the midget? Asked Talk again, with a hint of uncertainty in his voice. Unquestionably, he answered. I'm the tallest midget in the world. May I help you? Do you think we're lost? Repeated Milo. That's a very complicated problem. He said, why don't you go around to the side and ask the fat man? And he, too, quickly disappeared. The side of the house looked very like the front and back, and the door flew open the very instant they knocked. How nice of you to come by, exclaimed the man, who could have been the midget's twin brother. You must be the fat man, said Talk, learning not to count too much on appearance. The thinnest one in the world, he replied brightly. But if you have any questions, I suggest you try the thin man on the other side of the house." Just as they suspected, the other side of the house looked the same as the front, the back, and the side, and the door was again answered by a man who looked precisely like the other three. "What a pleasant surprise!" he cried happily. "I haven't had a visitor in as long as I can remember." "How long is that?" asked Milo. "I'm not sure. I'm sure I don't know," he replied. "Now, pardon me, I have to answer the door." "But you just did," said Talk. "Oh, yes, I had forgotten." "Are you the fattest thin man in the world?" asked Talk. "Do you know one that's fatter?" he asked impatiently. "I think you're all the same man," said Milo emphatically. "Shh," he cautioned, putting his finger to his lips and drawing Milo closer. "Do you want to ruin everything? You see, to tall men, I'm a midget, and to short men, I'm a giant. To the skinny ones, I'm a fat man, and to the fat ones, I'm a thin man. That way, I can hold 4 jobs at once. As you can see, though I'm never tall, I'm sorry, let me read that over. As you can see, though, I'm neither tall, nor short, nor fat, nor thin. In fact, I'm quite ordinary. But there are so many ordinary men that no one asks their opinion about anything. Now, what is your question?" "Are we lost?" asked Milo again. Said the man, scratching his head. "I haven't had such a difficult question in as long as I can remember. Would you mind repeating it? It has slipped my mind." Milo asked the question again. My, the man mumbled. "I know one thing for certain. It's much harder to tell whether you are lost than whether you were lost. For on many occasions, where you're going is exactly where you are. On the other hand, you often find that where you've been is not at all where you should have gone. And since it's much more difficult to find your way back from somewhere you've never left, I suggest you go there immediately and then decide. If you have any more questions, please ask the giant." And he slammed the door and pulled down the shade. "I hope you're satisfied," said Alec, when they'd returned from the house, and he bounced to his feet, bent down to awaken the snoring humbug, and started off, more slowly this time, in the direction of a large clearing. Now, obviously, that was a very confusing encounter, right? I laugh because that is that one character here, the giant, the midget, the fat man, the tall man, were all the same person. So I was thinking about the Westmoreland boys. You guys, if you ever want to play a joke, maybe you can be inspired by that funny little happening there with this guy. But the thing is, they didn't get their answer, did they? Both Alec Bing and this young guy, this character, gave them confusing answers about if they were lost or not. And so we're finding that these kind of characters are sprinkled throughout the book, aren't they? Where the answers they give they say the same thing just in different ways. It's kind of funny. Okay, so now they are off again. Evidently that just didn't work out. They didn't get the answer they want. And so here they go through the forest. Back at the top of page 115. "Do many people live here in the forest?" asked Milo as they trotted along together. "Oh, yes. They live in a wonderful city called Reality," he announced, smashing into one of the smaller trees and sending a cascade of nuts and leaves to the ground. "It's right this way." Now, we're about to read about 2 cities, okay? And one of them is called Reality. The other is called Illusions. Okay, so if you think about what those words mean, let's talk about that first. Reality is like what's right there. It's what's real, right? Okay, when something is real, that's where that word comes from. Reality, it's real. An illusion, maybe you've seen a cartoon or something where you've got someone's walking in the desert and they think they see a water hole or a lake or something like that, and it's an illusion. It's not really there, right? They're just kind of seeing things in their mind. That's an illusion. So you've got reality that's real, and an illusion is not real. Well, as you may predict, these cities have something to do with their names as well, okay? So keep those 2 things in mind as we keep reading. In a few more steps, the forest opened before them, and off to the left, a magnificent metropolis appeared. The rooftops shone like mirrors. The walls glistened with thousands of precious stones, and the broad avenues were paved in silver. "Is that it?" shouted Milo, running toward the shining streets. "Oh no, that's only illusions," said Alec. "The real city is over there." Okay, remember, illusions, they just think they're seeing something and it's not there. "What are illusions?" Milo asked, for it was the loveliest city he had ever seen. "Illusions," explained Alec, "are like mirages." Okay, mirages are like appearances that aren't real too. Things that you think you're seeing, but you're really not. And realizing that this didn't help much, he continued, "And mirages are things that aren't really there that you can see very clearly." "How can you see something that isn't there?" yawned the humbug, who wasn't fully awake yet. "Sometimes it's much simpler than seeing things that are," he said. "For instance, if something is there, you can only see it with your eyes open. But if it isn't there, you can see it just as well with your eyes closed. That's why imaginary things are often easier to see than real ones." "Then where is reality?" "Arr, arr," barked Hawk. "Right here," cried Alec, waving his arms. "You're standing in the middle of the main street." Okay, reality is what we can see, right? They looked around very carefully. Hawk sniffed suspiciously at the wind, and the humbug gingerly stabbed his cane in the air, but there was nothing at all to see. "It's really a very pleasant city," said Alec as he strolled down the street, pointing out several of the sights, which didn't seem to be there, and tipping his cap to the passers-by. There were great crowds of people rushing along with their heads down, and they all appeared to know exactly where they were going as they darted down and around the non-existent streets and in and out of the missing buildings. So you notice in reality, there's nothing there, right? There are people there, but no streets, no city, no buildings, nothing. "I don't see any city," said Milo very softly. "Neither do they," Alec remarked sadly, "but it hardly matters, for they don't miss it at all." "It must be very difficult to live in a city you can't see," Milo insisted, jumping aside as a line of cars and trucks went by. "Not at all, once you get used to it," said Alec. "But let me tell you how it happened." And as they strolled along the bustling and busy avenue, he began. So here's the story, right? "Many years ago, on this very spot, there was a beautiful city of fine houses and inviting spaces, and no one who lived here was ever in a hurry. The streets were full of wonderful things to see, and the people would often stop to look at them." "Didn't they have any place to go?" asked Milo. "Oh, to be sure," continued Alec. "But as you know, the most important reason for going from one place to another is to see what's in between. And they took great pleasure in doing just that." Okay, and you guys may have heard your parents. Maybe you're going on an adventure or a family road trip, and you go from one place to the next. I know when we go to Georgia back home, I love seeing those sights. So getting to Georgia is important, but all of those beautiful things we get to see on our drive there are just as important too. Crossing the Mississippi River, getting to stop in the different states and see and try some of our favorite restaurants, those things along the way. Well, Alec is telling him during this time, people would do that when they were going from one place to the next. They would always stop and enjoy their journey along the way. Okay, back on page 117. "Then one day, someone discovered that if you walked as fast as possible and looked at nothing but your shoes, you would arrive at your destination much more quickly. Soon, everyone was doing it. They all rushed down the avenues and hurried along the boulevards, seeing nothing of the wonders and beauties of their city as they went." Okay, so that started to change. People began to not look at anything, heads down, and go as fast as they could, not paying attention. Milo remembered the many times he had done that very same thing, And as hard as he tried, there were even things on his own street that he couldn't remember. No one paid any attention to how things looked, and as they moved faster and faster, everything grew uglier and dirtier, and as everything grew uglier and dirtier, they moved faster and faster, and at last a very strange thing began to happen. Because nobody cared, the city slowly began to disappear. Day by day, the buildings grew fainter and fainter, and the streets faded away until at last it was entirely visible. There was nothing to see at all. What did they do? The humbug inquired, suddenly taking an interest in these things. Nothing at all, continued Alec. They went right on living here, just as they'd always done, in the houses they could no longer see, and on the streets which had vanished, because nobody had noticed a thing. And that's the way they have lived to this very day. Hasn't anyone told them? Asked Milo. It doesn't do any good, Alec replied, for they can never see what they're in too much of a hurry to look for. Okay, and now I want to stop right here because this is so cool to me, especially with us going through this time of this coronavirus and us all being stuck at home. I know one of the lessons that for us, for our family, we have been so busy all the time the past several years that this kind of thing does happen where you kind of stop. You're so busy focusing on the things that you are doing that you forget sometimes what's important, not meaning to. And so you guys think about your family. I'm going to have a question today about this very thing, that think about some of the things now that you guys are in quarantine, you're in your house, and life has kind of stopped, right? Life has kind of stopped, and now you are enjoying things that maybe you haven't been able to enjoy for so long because we've all been so busy that we've kind of stopped looking and appreciating those things that are the most important. And God's kind of got us all on this hold, right? And so even going outside in your neighborhood, or if you live out in the countryside, where you start noticing you start having fun in your family again. Maybe your families are doing things that you haven't done in a while, like playing games and cooking supper together and going on family walks and hikes and things like that. So isn't that kind of cool that even in this chapter, we can kind of bring into where we're at right now. Our reality is very different than it used to be 2 months ago, right? And so I want you to be thinking about that. Be thinking about what are some of the things that you're enjoying now in your life that during this quarantine time that maybe you had not done before. Okay, let's keep going on page 118. Why don't they live in illusions? Suggested the humbug. It's much prettier. Many of them do, he answered, walking in the direction of the forest once again. But it's just as bad to live in a place where what you do see isn't there as it is to live in one where what you don't see is. Now let me read that again because that was confusing. It's just as bad to live in a place where what you do see isn't there as it is to live in one where what you don't see is there. Perhaps someday you can have one city as easy to see as illusions and as hard to forget as reality, Milo remarked. That will happen only when you bring back rhyme and reason. And remember, that's that common sense that makes sense of everything, right? And rhyme and reason, what they really mean is the two princesses, right? Rhyme and reason. And we know figuratively rhyme and reason means like common sense. Wisdom back into the kingdom, right? Okay, said Alex, smiling, for he had seen right through Milo's plan. Now let's hurry or we'll miss the evening concert. They followed him quickly up a flight of steps which couldn't be seen and through a door which didn't exist. In a moment, they had left reality, which is sometimes a hard thing to tell, and stood in a completely different part of the forest. The sun was dropping slowly from sight, and stripes of purple and orange and crimson and gold piled themselves on top of the distant hills. Excuse me. The last shafts of light waited patiently for a flight of wrens to find their way home, and a group of anxious stars had already taken their place. "Here we are," cried Alec, and with a sweep of his arm, he pointed toward an enormous symphony orchestra. "Isn't it a grand sight?" There were at least 1,000 musicians ranged in a great arc before them. To the left and right were the violins and cellos, whose bows moved in great waves, and behind them, in a numberless profusion, the piccolos, flutes, clarinets, oboes, bassoons, horns, trumpets, trombones, and tubas were all playing at once. At the very rear, so far away that they could hardly be seen, were the percussion instruments. And lastly, in a long line up one side of a steep slope, were the solemn bass fiddles. On a high podium in front of stood the conductor, a tall giant man with the dark, deep-set eyes and a thin mouth, placed carelessly between his long, pointed nose and his long, pointed chin. Here's a picture of him. Kind of neat guy. He used no baton, and a baton would be like a little stick of what a symphony conductor would use when they are up there, conducting the symphony. He used no baton, but conducted with large, sweeping movements which seemed to start at his toes and work slowly up through his body and along his slender arms and end finally at the tips of his graceful fingers. "I don't hear any music," said Milo. "That's right," said Alec. "You don't listen to the concert. You watch it. Now pay attention." As the conductor waved his arms, he molded the air like handfuls of soft clay, and the musicians carefully followed his every direction. "What are they playing?" asked Hawk, looking up inquisitively at Alex. "The sunset, of course. They play it every evening about this time." Now, we know we have beautiful sunsets here in Texas, don't we? When the sun is setting, it is, right at that time when the sun is going down, it's about to be dark. So they are not playing music, they are playing the sunset. Interesting, what does that mean? They do? Asked Milo quizzically. "Naturally," answered Alec. "And they also play morning, noon, and night when, of course, it's morning, noon, or night. Why, there wouldn't be any color in the world unless they played it." "Each instrument plays a different one," he explained, "and depending, of course, on what season it is and how the weather is to be." Let me make sure I didn't lose my place, guys. I'm sorry. Yes, each instrument plays a different one, he explained. "And depending, of course, on what season it is and how the weather is to be, the conductor chooses his score and directs the day. But watch, the sunset has almost set. The sun has almost set, and in a moment you can ask Chroma himself." Remember that chroma. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. The last colors slowly faded from the western sky, and as they did, one by one, the instruments stopped, until only the bass fiddles, in their somber, slow movement, were left to play the night, and a single set of silver bells brightened the constellations. The conductor let his arms fall limply at his sides and stood quite still as the darkness claimed the forest. "That was a very beautiful sunset," said Milo, walking to the podium. "It should be," was the reply. "We've been practicing since the world began." And reaching down, the speaker picked Milo off the ground and set him on the music stand. "I am Chroma the Great," he continued, gesturing broadly with his hands, "conductor of color, maestro of pigment, and director of the entire spectrum." Okay, now here you have those synonyms, right? Those synonyms of color, pigment, and spectrum. Synonyms that mean the same. "Do you play all day long?" asked Milo when he had introduced himself. "Ah, yes, all day, every day," he sang out, then pirouetted gracefully around the platform. "I rest only at night, and even then they play on." "What would happen if you stopped?" asked Milo, who didn't quite believe that color happened this way. "See for yourself," roared Chroma, and he raised both hands high over his head. Immediately the instruments that were playing stopped, and at once all color vanished. The world looked like an enormous coloring book that had never been used. Everything appeared in simple black outlines, and it looked as if someone with a set of paints the size of a house and brush as wide could stay happily occupied for years. Then Chroma lowered his arms, the instruments began again, and the color returned. "You see what a dull place this world would be without color?" he said, bowing until his chin almost touched the ground. "But what pleasure to lead my violins in a serenade of spring green, or hear my trumpets blare out the blue sea, and then watch the oboes tint it all in warm yellow sunshine, and rainbows are best of all, and blazing neon signs, and taxicabs with stripes, and the soft muted tones of a foggy day. We play them all." As Chroma spoke, Milo sat with his eyes open wide, and Alec, Talk, and the Humbug looked on in wonder. They were amazed. "Now I really must get some sleep," Chroma yawned. "Oh, we've had lightning, fireworks, and parades for the last few nights, and I've had to be up to conduct them. But tonight is sure to be quiet." Then putting his large hand on Milo's shoulder, he said, "Be a good fellow and watch my orchestra till morning, won't you? And be sure to wake me at 5:23 for the sunrise. Good night, good night, good night." With that, he leaped lightly from the podium and in 3 long steps vanished into the forest. "That's a good idea," said Talk, making himself comfortable in the grass as the bug grumbled himself quickly to sleep, and Alec stretched out in midair. And Milo, full of thoughts and questions, curled up on the pages of tomorrow's music and eagerly awaited the dawn. Okay, and that's the end of chapter 10. So now he was given a job though, right? Chroma the Great asked him to watch the orchestra, and then he said, "Make sure you wake me at 5:23 for the sunrise." But now they've all gone to sleep. So let's find out what happens in chapter 11 tomorrow, okay? It was great reading with you guys. See you later. Bye.